What's going on, everyone? Peter Hunt Spitek here from DualShockers.com, bringing you a quick discussion about some recent gaming news regarding Starfield and Bethesda's seemingly unorthodox method of responding to criticism of the game. Before we get into all of that, though, I am joined today by the newest video producer here at DualShockers, Cristian Macias. Cristian, how's it going, man? How are things?
Praise the sun. I am ready to sit down, drink some coffee, and talk Starfield with you.
I am so excited to hear your thoughts on Starfield because we've mentioned it before pretty briefly about just like I've mentioned that I'm not like the biggest Starfield fan. I got like a passive agreement from you is what I would call the response I've gotten from you. So I just want to know, what is your take on Starfield? Did you like it? How did you play it? I just want to know your general thoughts on this.
As of today, I have officially placed Starfield into my backlog of games on my backlogged profile, and I've played about 10 hours of it. I was really actually excited for it back when it was originally coming out, and I was kind of excited to meet the game on its terms. I understood that, you know, some of the planets were largely a little bit empty, but that the kind of emphasis on the game was going to be the overall like main quest. And for a while, I enjoyed it. I was pleasantly surprised by it. But after a couple hours, I found my kind of time with Starfield to kind of just wane. And so about, 10 to 12 hours is kind of where like, okay, I've seen enough for now. There's a couple of big releases that I'm excited about right now. I'll get to Starfield after those. And so for now, I'm just kind of on the back burner. Just whenever I have time, maybe I'll jump back into it.
Okay, so it's the thing you're going to come back to, though.
I would like to.
Yeah.
I would like to.
I like bounce right off this thing, and I'm disappointed too because like I am a huge Skyrim fan. I don't know if I'm exactly like a Bethesda fan in general because I don't really love Fallout. I know that is like people love Fallout, but I've never really been able to get into them. But I'm a big Elder Scrolls fan, so I was pretty excited for Starfield. I was kind of let down by it felt kind of clunky to me. It didn't feel very cohesive. With like loading screens on loading screens on loading screens. I didn't really understand like the ships, you can fly into outer space, but I didn't really see a whole lot of reason to do that because you can't fly directly to a planet from there. There wasn't really much for me to see out in space. I think people could argue like I didn't necessarily give it like a super fair shot. I played maybe 5 hours, but to me, that's enough to know whether or not I like a video game. You know what I mean?
Okay, sure.
And
I have so much time to spend with games.
Exactly. And for a game as big as Starfield and for a year as sort of stacked as this has been, I just wasn't able to give it like more time. And I didn't even really want to. It felt like I was spending just a lot of my time looking at loading screens and stuff like that. But that's actually kind of what we're here talking about today because people have been pointing out recently that Bethesda has been responding to negative Starfield reviews on Steam directly. So people have been seeing this. This has sort of been going on all of November, but it's only really been like picked up on and talked about starting this week. Basically, to give you a quick rundown, there are over 80,000 reviews of Starfield on Steam. It was in like the positive Steam classification for its reviews up until recently when it switched down to more mixed. I don't think that necessarily means that it's a bad game or anything like that. But people have been sort of interested by Bethesda, like I said, directly responding to some of these comments. So I'm going to read 3 of these comments just to you. This is aggregated on Twitter by someone called Juicehead. I think that's kind of fun. Their profile picture is just some orange juice. So I'm going to read you some of the highlighted comments here as pointed out in this tweet. So this is directly from Bethesda. This first one is from November 9th. It says, while there may be loading screens in between fast traveling, just consider the amount of data for the expansive gameplay that is procedurally generated to load flawlessly in under 3 seconds. We believe that shortcoming will not hinder our players from getting lost in the world we created. Next screenshot here is from a post from November 2nd that says, we are sorry that you do not like landing on different planets and are finding many of them empty. Some of Starfield's planets are meant to be empty by design, but that's not boring. When the astronauts went to the moon, there was nothing there. They certainly weren't bored. The intention of Starfield's exploration is to evoke a feeling of smallness in players and makes you feel overwhelmed. you can continue to explore and find worlds that do have resources you need or hidden outposts to look through. And then the final one here is you can fly, you can shoot, you can mine, you can loot. I love this little rhyme here, I guess. This is from November 27th, by the way. Starfield is an RPG with hundreds of hours of quests to complete and characters to meet. Most quests will also vary on your character's skills and decisions, massively changing the outcome of your playthrough. Try creating different characters with backgrounds and characteristics that clash or are opposite of your previous character. You'll feel like you are playing a totally different game. Put points into different skills from a character you've previously created, and you're going to and now you're faced with completely different decisions to make and difficulties to encounter. There are so many layers to Starfield that you'll find things you never knew were possible after playing for hundreds of hours. I want to throw it to you, Cristian. After hearing some of these reviews, some of these responses to the reviews that Bethesda's had, just generally, what do you think of that? Do you think that this is kind of a solid, transparent look at game design coming from a major AAA studio like Bethesda? Or do you kind of read this more as like a studio kind of awkwardly like clapping back at players who just didn't get what they were going for?
I feel like it's totally the latter. Were this kind of thing were Bethesda to do something like this before the game's release, I feel like that would maybe lean towards more of a look at like transparency and kind of the philosophy behind the game. When it's coming out, months after the game's release, it feels like a little bit of like saving face after some negative reviews. And you can kind of feel that tension when you look at things like the Game Awards and, seeing Starfield miss any kind of nominations at the TGAs, right? So it kind of feels like they're trying to save face with their fans a little bit, but I get it because, game philosophy of Starfield feels a little bit dated, and that was one of the biggest critiques, right? And you just read things like the qualifying the game with descriptions of the game, which to me doesn't really mean anything. And like there are some valid critiques here, like the loading, which doesn't seem to be a lot of, we're in new gen games where we get to explore and do lots of. Spider-Man 2 just came out. The fast travel in that game is like
it's wild.
Instant,
it's insane.
Right? It's wild. So yeah, when I compare to No Man's Sky, it just feels like maybe more of a dated game. But to me, the biggest thing here is curation of the levels that Starfield has produced. There's a kind of anecdote where I think it was Todd Howard mentioned that like only 10% of the planets in Starfield have actual life on them. And I think, if I remember correctly, No Man's Sky did something very similar. There were people talking about the comparison between Starfield and No Man's Sky, which maybe is a little bit of a tired comparison, but like it's kind of a little bit
valid enough.
It's sure. And No Man's Sky had a similar thing where they had to bump up the factor from reality. And it's a game. We want the game to be fun first and foremost. And No Man's Sky found the fun by introducing more kind of quirky elements and steered away from more of the grounded realness. I'm not saying that's the primary issue of Starfield, but it could be one of the things that led to gamers being a bit disappointed in Starfield. And it's one of the things that they're kind of responding to here. What do you think?
Yeah, I would say that I come from it from more of I do appreciate game design philosophy, and I don't make games, but I do know when a game is good, and I can usually pinpoint why a game is good and why things work, and I think I'm really good at pinpointing why a game doesn't work for me. And so like I do think it's interesting. Like this isn't to me in like saying, well, you're wrong. Actually, all these loading screens are great. I think it does help me understand, though, why there are so many loading screens, right? For them to say, we get, where was this? Expansive gameplay that's procedurally generated to load flawlessly in under 3 seconds. I get that for me, that was a shortcoming that was too much, right? They say, we believe that shortcoming will not hinder our players from getting lost in the worlds we created. It did for me, because it meant that every single section of gameplay was broken up by just like taking off and landing and having to like watch these same animations of things flying around and whatever. To me, I do appreciate that look though into development of them saying, we knew that was a problem, right? Or like we knew that was a shortcoming, but we don't think that is going to be a big enough shortcoming to really hinder the player's enjoyment. I do think that that's interesting. The one thing I do agree with you on though, is them saying like, yeah, some of the planets are meant to be empty by design. But that's not boring, because the astronauts who went to the moon found that there was nothing on the moon and they weren't bored. And it's like, well, yeah, because they were like human beings experiencing one of the most like no one, like so few people are going to experience that. Like that is such a wild comparison to me.
I'm in my living room, you know? Like,
Yeah.
I'm staring at my screen. Yeah.
Yes.
I can only be transported so far.
Well, and
so
to your
much.
point though about like No Man's Sky, right? Like I've played other games like Starfield, right? That were able to make something out of maybe more mundane tasks of space exploration and whatnot. So to say like, well, it's not boring because the moon isn't boring. Well, yeah, because like, if I went to the moon in real life, there would be all sorts of things that I could look at and do and whatever. Whereas, you know, a video game by the very nature of being a video game is limited in the ways that you can interact with it, you know? Yeah, so I don't know. Yeah, what's up?
Citizen Sleeper is you know, an RPG where you're in intergalactic, you know, role playing in the ruins of interplanetary capitalism. Like that game is like it's all text based. You're rolling dice, and you know you're in space, and like that to me was like far more gripping than some of like the narrative that I found, like the kind of answers I could respond to in Starfield. If I were to do some kind of review like this, would they respond to me? Would they respond to me and say things like, "Well, you know, our team sort of wrote these things, and we think they're pretty like gripping character decisions. We don't think they'll hinder your experience with Starfield." Would they say something like this?
Yeah, I don't know. You know what I mean? It's one of those things where to me, like, I don't necessarily, I think a lot of people took this with some bad faith. Maybe I'm just the type of person who isn't going to read it like that when something like this does sort of happen. You know what I mean? But hey, I think that read is totally valid, right?
If anything, I'm just happy that we're not going after developers in this regard. And if anything, maybe there's a way we can read this where it feels like the studios maybe kind of backing their developers, which is actually a good thing.
And that's the thing too, is like, just because I don't like the loading screens, right? Like clearly the people working on the game said like, hey, we believe that the loading, like you can understand why it loads like this because of what it's doing behind the scenes. And then also we believe that works. For me, it doesn't work, but hey, that's just my personal opinion. You know what I mean? So many other people have loved Starfield this year. And it's just, that is a barrier for me. Right. And I think that might be, I wonder how I would feel differently about that. Maybe, if this came out a few years ago before we were sort of spoiled with the quick loading, right, of things like Spider-Man and whatever else. Like I remember playing Astrobot when that came out, and just being so blown away by how fast things were loading now, right? And so maybe it's because of that, and maybe I don't have the attention span anymore. I mean, I remember, this is another Bethesda game, Morrowind, when you like loaded into that game, it was like a full 60 seconds to get into that game, which is like, would not fly today. You know what I mean? But yeah, I would hope that it is them backing up their decisions, right? I think for the most part, I do not read these comments from them as them saying, you're wrong for feeling that way. The only one that, you know, we just talked about is like that one about going to the moon, because I just think that's a silly comparison. But to me, it seems like they're just saying like, hey, here are the choices we made and why.
Sure.
And I personally do appreciate that sort of transparency. And I feel like we don't get that so frequently from major publishers or major developers, right? I feel like we do tend to get that in smaller games, especially if it's been in like early access. You know, I feel like, is it Super Giant or Super Massive that makes Hades?
Super Giant.
Super Massive is Until Dawn then. But so Super Giant, you know, was very transparent with a lot of its development of Hades, because that game was in early access for like 3 years? You know what I mean? Sure. Or I look at a studio like Larian with Baldur's Gate 3, right? That game has also been in early access forever. So you have these studios talking directly with their communities. Do you think the fact that this is post-release changes that sort of those sort of implications?
Yeah, because it's purely optics, right? Now that the product is out and we can engage with it on various levels, reacting to it in that way just is going to naturally have my own read of the actual product itself. So we're putting our own read of the words from whoever is doing this, right? It could be just like someone from the marketing team or some kind of social person on their team. It could influence my read to kind of, you know, sway me to believe it's kind of more of my personal belief that it just feels a bit more like, you know, saving face or kind of clapping back per se. But yeah, I know it's difficult.
Yeah, yeah, and I don't feel like it is like clapping back at all. I've seen a lot of people sort of using that that phrase. I'm like, I don't think that's what this is. I don't think that.
No,
at least it
it's
doesn't come
nowhere near as
across
harsh. No,
right? Yeah, it doesn't come
sure.
across to me as like harsh or like that they're saying like, well, you're an idiot. Goodbye. You know what I mean? So then question for you is, do you think that this is the sort of behavior that you would want from other AAA developers? I mean, whether, pre-release or post-release?
My my short answer is yes. I think just yes, period. Because the normal way things have been going in the games industry is kind of radio silence.
Yes.
And then out of nowhere, in a couple weeks later, layoffs. And I 100% prefer more of like a transparency and like, hey, these are the kind of creative choices that we made. We believe in our product. And, if I hear reassurance of like, we're hearing you and we'll kind of take these things into consideration because, Starfield is getting DLC down the line. If they do make some fundamental changes to respond to some of those criticisms, that is a win. No matter what they say on Steam or what they put out on Twitter, that is 100% a win. So yes, I'm glad. I would like to see more of this in that regard.
Yeah, me too, because I love knowing why when it comes to games. I love knowing why was that decision made, right? Like, and if something doesn't resonate with me personally, like, I imagine that most studios have heard complaints internally before launching a game, right? Like, like that's just the nature of creating something with so many different people, all of their hands, like all of those people in the kitchen, right? Like, people are going to know, hey, this doesn't work right, or hey, this isn't exactly how we want it to be. But so then they have to come up with solutions for that, right? And sometimes it pans out, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes they internally have those conversations about like, do we think that this shortcoming is going to be overlooked by players? Or are players going to be, is this going to be a barrier for them to enjoy this game? They internally had those conversations, looked at the game, said no, right? I like hearing about that, even if it's something that I kind of disagree with, right? Just because I'm interested in the process of making games, because that also makes me feel like I can understand what makes a game work better or what makes a game less enjoyable for me. But
it's also just another barrier because we tend to like, game development is hard, and we tend to just like, like we're just some dude sitting in a chair, like just saying things, right? But like anything to humanize developers, on no matter what scale, is always going to be a net positive in the games industry, no matter what.
1,000%. And to your point there, like, how long did it take for them to develop Starfield? At least 5 years, right? I mean, they announced it in like 2018. Yeah. So like, for me to just sit here and go like, yeah, I don't like it's bad, and then move on, like, oh my gosh, so much work went into that. And so to me, being able to peel back the layers here and understand, hey, here's why it was like that is interesting. I can still think it's bad. That's my opinion. I'm allowed to have that. But to be able to understand it on a little bit of a deeper level, I think is always a good thing. Well, thank you so much for chatting with me today, Cristian. I really appreciate your time, and I appreciate anyone who's watching us right now. If this is the sort of content you're interested in from us here at DualShockers, and are wanting more of these more discussion-based videos, I would love to hear your feedback in the comments down below. I will respond to you just like Bethesda Game Studios is responding to comments under Starfield. But while you're down there, remember to like this video, subscribe to DualShockers, and click the bell icon to be notified whenever we post more Starfield or conversation content. Later.